This is Pastor Rick with Bethel Community Church. I am for him and for his. Today we are continuing in our series about how to spit in the eye of uncertainty, exercising faith in God during times of uncertainty. Now, today you might hear a few things in the background because this is an active day here at Bethel Community Church. We are partnering with Truckin' for Tykes to quickly get some non-perishable essential items down to the Louisiana area because of that nasty hurricane Laura. So there's children and stuff, and so that's just a part of life, and I hope that doesn't bother you. There's also some practicing going on for the worship service tomorrow, so you might hear some good music too. So all those things are good, but don't be surprised if you hear the occasional sounds in the background that you're not accustomed to. So today, as we look at how to spit in the face of uncertainty, we want to focus on, I think, something that is essential in our walk of faith with Jesus Christ, and that is learning to believe the impossible. Yes, that's what we need to do. Last couple of weeks we've been looking at ways to spit in the face of uncertainty by literally learning to not be surprised by what happens in life, because life is filled with surprises. And instead, we need to trust the one who is never surprised. And we also have talked in this series about seeing his work even though it's not visible through the eyes of faith. Because God is always at work around us and in us and through us, whether we realize it or understand it or see it at all. Today we want to focus on the ability to believe the impossible. Matthew 19:26 says, Jesus looked at them and said, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. He was talking about the barriers between us and a holy God, and how in spite of the fact that it seems impossible, we cannot satisfy him or live up to the fulfillment of the law and the requirements of a holy God within ourselves. Through God, that impossibility is overcome, specifically through his Son, Jesus Christ. And then in Luke 1:37 we read, for with God nothing is impossible. Nothing is impossible. So inherent in any walk of faith with Christ is the ability to believe that what is not possible in our eyes is possible with a God who has no limits. Now, I want you to understand here, we're not talking about us actually doing the impossible, but rather what we are talking about is God doing what we thought was impossible, and sometimes he does that in and through us. But our job is not actually to do the impossible ourselves. That's God's job. That's God's thing. And if he so chooses to do the impossible in some way or manner in and through us, well, that's up to him. But he's not bound to do that. I am reminded of a joke about a guy that was on his motorcycle, a good guy, had lived a very good life, was still young. He was riding his motorcycle along the coastline of California, the Pacific coastline, and he's just having a time of communion with God as he's enjoying the ride. And suddenly he hears a voice from heaven, and it says something like this: my son, you have lived a good and righteous life, and you've served me so far, and I am well pleased, and I would like to do something for you. So what would you like me to do for you? Boy, wouldn't that be great? So the biker was thinking about it, and he responded, Lord, I would love it if you would build a bridge between California and Hawaii so that anytime I wanted, I could just hop on my bike and just take a cruise, however many miles it is, and it's a far piece, I'm sure, and go to Hawaii and back on my bike. And God hesitated a little bit, and he said, "My son, I'm a little disappointed that you have asked for such a materialistic thing and such a thing that is focused just on you. I would have to move dirt and establish pillars and do lots of things. And I can certainly do that. That's in a minute. I built the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. I can do that, but I would be pleased if you would ask for something that would be more helpful to mankind." And so the biker thought about that, and he says, "I'm sorry, Lord." He said, "I know with you all things are possible. So maybe you can do this for me and for all of my fellow men. Can you please help us to understand why a woman cries, and why she sometimes cries when she's happy, and why she sometimes cries when she's mad, and when she says, if you ask her if anything is wrong and she says nothing, what does that really mean? And how do you know if it really means nothing and if it really doesn't? And in general, how do we as men understand women?" There was a pause in heaven, and God's response was, "My son, do you want 1 lane or 2 lanes on that bridge?" So all things are possible with God. He chooses what he will do. He does such in accord with his will and his purpose and his grace and his mercy and his fulfillment of his plan. Philippians 4:13 says, "I can do all this through him who gives me strength." I believe the King James states it like this: "I can do all things through him who gives me strength." So doing the impossible isn't what we're talking about outside of God's help. We in and of ourselves cannot do the impossible, but with God who sets the boundaries of all life, through him we can do all things. It's not like us being Superman, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound or outrun speeding locomotives. None of us are supermen, but God does awesome things through his powerful influence and presence and empowerment in and through us often. And what we think is impossible isn't always impossible. All too often, we assume something is impossible rather than default to trusting God in all things and in all ways. This is especially seen in how we deal with uncertainty and the unexpected surprises of life. We just assume that these things have no hope, that everything is lost, that all is going, falling apart. And that may not be at all what God is doing. And the impossible things that we think we can't do, even in the face of uncertainty, are not necessarily defined as impossible by God. So allow me, if you will, to, in just a few moments, share a few ways in which believing God for what we think is impossible can help us to literally spit in the face of uncertainty. Now I got to clean the camera. All right. Here's one thing I want you to take with you. Learn to not trust in what you are so very sure you know. Be teachable. Be teachable. Sometimes we think we have everything figured out and we've got all the answers, but you know what? We are always learning because we live on a planet and in a life environment in which there is much we do not know. So don't assume everything you think you know is everything there is to know. Be teachable and let your teacher be God and His Holy Spirit and His Word. Do you know what an ornithologist is? Well, I confess to you that's not a word or a profession I think often of, but recently, for some reason in my reading, I came across an article by an ornithologist, and for some reason I read portions of it. An ornithologist is basically a person who studies birds. It is a person who is kind of an expert on birds. There are people with PhDs and who do lifelong research on birds. And they try to understand and analyze and be able to even predict how birds migrate, the kinds of foods they eat, you know, their mating habits, their ability to navigate, their timing seasonally, if they are migratory, how they make nests, all those things, how they teach their little birdie kids to fly, all that sorts of things. But one of the big mysteries to ornithologists is they can't figure out the common link between all birds that is the secret to flight. Because the designs of all birds are kind of different, and sometimes they kind of defy some of the aeronautics we think we understand, aerodynamics rather. They don't understand how where the strength comes from sometimes, and their ability to navigate during flight, their ability to sense air currents and formations that they make, and all that. And so ornithologists don't know everything about birds, even though they spend entire lifetimes of themselves and other colleagues to understand that. And especially about the mystery of flight, they are sometimes perplexed. Well, here's the thing. You know what? Those birds don't need ornithologists to fly. I'm looking out the window of my office right now, and I see a couple birds flying. I don't see any guys with glasses and PhDs around them instructing them on how to fly. You know, sometimes God gives the knowledge. Do not assume that what you think you know is all that is needed to be known. Do not rest on the limitations of your knowledge to define what is impossible. In other words, let God determine what is impossible and possible, and you will be amazed. Psalms 3:6 says, "In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight." In other words, in everything you face, in every uncertainty, in every unexpected surprise, go to Him. Make that your default. Quit trying to figure it out just on your own, because you will be limited in what you think is possible by just what you know. And my friend, God knows a lot more than you do. He really does. You may think you're smart. You ain't that smart. Here's another takeaway I offer to you this morning or in this message about how to spit in the eye of uncertainty through faith. Learn to step out from beneath your 8-foot ceiling. Pastor Rick, what are you talking about? Are you talking in riddles here? Well, to explain this better, let me take you with me to Genesis chapter 15, verses 4 through 6. This is a dialogue recorded between God and, at that point, Abram, who eventually becomes Abraham. And this is the place where God gives him the promise of many, many descendants. And the problem is, Abraham had a barren wife, and Sarai, at that time, who became Sarah. And Abraham's like, huh? How's that going to be? All I have is a concubine, basically, that is going to give me an heir. And God says, no, that's not how it's going to happen. So let me just read it with you. Hopefully you can join Genesis 15, 4 through 6. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "This man will not be your heir." He's talking about, the child of the concubine. but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. And then he took him outside, make note of that, and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you could even count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And Abram believed the Lord, and God credited it to him as righteousness. So, what happened here? Abram is inside when this conversation between him and God begins. And Abram was, based on his comments, only seeing what he thought was possible. And so what happened is, to even further illustrate God's amazing ability to define what is impossible, God had him go outside. So Abram went from what was, most Bible scholars say the tents of that day were maybe 8 foot high. So he went out from under the 8-foot ceiling, and he went out into God's creation. And God instructed him to look up at his ceiling and see what was to be seen. You know, for many of us, our vision, our faith, our hope in God is limited by our own ceiling that is above us. We are limited by only what we can see and what we are accustomed to. We are limited, if you will, by the 8-foot ceilings in our lives, rather than by the limitless sky of God and his creation and his resources and his goodness and his grace. I'm asking you this morning, or in this message, what ceiling are you living under today? What 8-foot ceiling of uncertainty is stopping you from stepping outside and seeing the night sky with the countless stars in heavens? You can't even count them. The possibilities, the endless opportunities, the endless ways in which God has created and will create in your life. What self-imposed or self-defined limitations are you placing on the God of abundance? Because that's who God is. He is not a God of just get by. He is a God of abundance. He is able to give us exceedingly beyond what we just need. Ephesians 3:20 says, now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. And what is that power? That is the presence of his Holy Spirit living and breathing through us as we allow him to, and the power of his presence enabling us through faith to do what we think is impossible through him. Through him. So I hope you take that one with you. Here's another one I offer to you. How to spit in the face of uncertainty. This will help. You got to realize, and this is where God's real sense of humor comes in. You got to realize that God actually delights sometimes in doing the flat out ridiculous. You said, what are you talking about, Pastor Rick? Well, what I mean is, when we look at God intervening, doing the impossible, we think of all the serious stuff, the urgent stuff, the life or death type things. We think about, God is able to heal, and yes, he is, my friend. I've seen it more than once. I've seen cancers flee in his presence. I've seen cancers just go away by his touch. There are certainly that where God will step in and save life. Save the day, protect people, protect you. Yeah, that certainly happens. And even our most dire circumstances are not beyond the possibility of his deliverance and his intercession in a miraculous way. But sometimes God wants to teach us, and he wants to teach us, I guess, when we're more pliable or more receptive or more casual. And so he will even do the impossible in kind of non-essential or not life and death matters. I want to give you a couple of examples. Here's one, and it's one of my favorite, and it's also about one of my favorite prophets, Elisha. It's recorded in 2 Kings 6, 3 through 7. Just going to read it for you. It says, the God's word says, they went to the Jordan and began to cut down trees. They is Elisha's apprentice prophets, if you will. He's kind of establishing a school to teach prophets how to be prophets and to serve the Lord. It's kind of a seminary sort of thing, or a Bible college, if you will. And so they're kind of getting ready for that. So they went to the Jordan and began to cut down trees. And as one of them was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water. "Oh no, my lord," he cried out. "It was borrowed. Hey, it's not mine. I got this from a friend. Now it's down at the bottom, in the water of the river Jordan." And the man of God, who is Elisha, asked, "Where did it fall?" When he showed him the place, Elisha cut a stick and threw it there and made the iron float. "Lift it out," he said. Then the man reached out his hand and took it. And so Elisha, because of his tremendous faith in God, was an instrument whereby God could do what was definitely seen as impossible and often demonstrated always as impossible. And God helped the iron of that day rise to the top of the water, and they were able to retrieve this. Now, I got to ask you, here's a funny thing. Was that a life or death matter? I mean, it's not like he lost, $10,000 of gold or something, or precious metal in the water, or that he lost something that he needed to live. I mean, it was an inconvenience. It was going to cause him embarrassment. He'd probably have to pay the guy that he borrowed the axe from. He'd probably have to pay him back for that. But in the end, it wasn't a life or death thing, and yet God, performed this miracle, or what was thought to be impossible. He made it a possibility and an actuality. So it's kind of funny that he would do that, but then you think they're building a school to learn how to be a prophet, and I'm sure they had interests in the miracles that Elisha was kind of famous for. And so God, instead of taking them to a classroom, he gives them an on-the-spot live illustration. Stuff you can't learn in books or through lectures or through sermons. He taught them through a miracle. Not a life or death miracle, but just, hey, I have no limitations. What you think is impossible, that's not what defines what's impossible for me, which, by the way, is nothing. So here's another example that kind of falls in that line, I think, and that is the very first miracle that Jesus did of turning water, or at least the ones that have been recorded, in which he turned water into wine at a wedding celebration. Now, that, in my book, is also not a life or death matter, and yet Jesus performed a miracle of turning water into wine. That is not thought possible. He did that. There wasn't even any grapes added. And so no fermentation process over time. And he not only turned the water into wine, but it was said to be the very, very best wine at the event. So, it's kind of funny he did that. Wow, why'd he do that? Maybe to teach his mother. I don't know. She was the one kind of getting on him. Hey, do something, I don't know if she realized he did miracles yet. Maybe she did. I got a feeling she did because she's a mom. And so in the end, Jesus did the impossible. Not life or death, but I think he needed to show, and also just cared about his mother and her friendship with this couple that was getting married, and did the impossible. So I think one of the takeaways is that the most ridiculous, just plain aggravating, just plain annoying occurrences you may experience, which is often the uncertainties and unexpected issues of life, may be when God decides to show his awesome work in you as well, and to you, to teach you. How many times have you lost your keys and you don't have one of those electronic things that finds them, and you pray for God to find them. And you know what? He helps you to find them. And by now you're sweating. You know, I shared an event with my cell phone where it came off the top of my car. And yeah, I was praying to God, and that thing fell on the road. It was run over literally by a car, and somebody walking down the street saw it in the street, picked it up, took it to the police department. They called me, Vandalia cops called me, saying, "Hey, we got your cell phone here." And, you know, I went to get it. Works fine, using it today. That's not a life or death miracle, but that's an amazing miracle. And I think God was chuckling a little bit when he did that. And he showed me, hey, I'm watching out over you. You know, even these little annoyances and frustrations and stuff, I'm with you in them. And I'm not beyond doing a miracle now and then just for that. So trust him in the little things, even in the little uncertainties and frustrations and unexpected. And if you do that, I think what we learn is to give him trust in the big things when they come. Emily Dickinson said, I dwell in possibility. And I read that quote and I'm thinking, you know what? Every follower of Christ should dwell in possibility. Shouldn't we? We should pray to God and expect that he's going to do something. It may not be the miracle or the way in which we are looking for it, but with God, all things are possible. And he tells us that we can do all things through him, especially, my friends, in the face of uncertainty. You know, in Jeremiah 32:27, God went to Jeremiah the prophet who was struggling with his faith and with other things. Fatigue and depression. And God asked him straight up, hey, is anything too hard for me? I want to ask you today, because God's asking you, is anything in your life too hard for him? Okay, I want to conclude with this. The big question before you and me is, do we really believe that God can do what we think is impossible? And our answer to that is more important than you may imagine, because it will define if you serve a God of your definition, limited by what you think is possible and impossible, or if you serve the real God, the true God of the Bible, and the God who loves you, who is not limited by anything. Not by anything but his will and purpose in your life and mine. C.S. Lewis wrote in his children's book trilogy, actually, concerning the lion who was named Aslan, who represented Jesus. And he points out at one point in those books, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I believe it was, concerning really a reference to the Lion of Judah. He is no tame lion. Yes, he is an awesome, loving lion, but he's no tame lion, and he doesn't bounce to our instructions. He doesn't react to our instructions. He is not limited by our impossibilities. You know, before you can begin the journey to experience the impossible becoming possible in your life through Jesus, you must believe God is exactly who he claims he is, and that is the holy and righteous and just and capable and limitless God of the universe, who is good and love and truth. Don't try to figure him out or explain him. Just trust him. And as the psalmist writes, taste and see that the Lord is good. If you do that, my friend, there is no uncertainty or surprises that can defeat you. With God, remember, there are no surprises, only opportunities. I am Rick Feiss, pastor of Bethel Community Church. I am for him and for his. If you'd like to talk, you can text or call or leave a message, 937-671-5685. 5276. May God bless.